Production of The Appeal and Now This. I'm Jay Willis, your host for today, senior contributor at The Appeal. And today we're going to be discussing a political movement of elected officials who are publicly rejecting police union campaign support. Across the country, we've had over 40 lead prosecutors sign a letter committing to refusing endorsements or campaign contributions from police and sheriff unions or other political organizations like those. They're saying that those contributions and endorsements tell voters that DAs are aligned with police values and that this is a conflict of interest because it can undermine confidence in investigations of police misconduct. It's sort of hard to say you're conducting independent, meaningful oversight of cops when their union funds your re-election bids. So today we're joined by 4 prosecutors who signed on to that letter. That's Contra Costa County DA Diana Becton, St. Louis City Circuit Attorney Kim Gardner, Portsmouth Commonwealth's Attorney Stephanie Morales, and Philadelphia DA Larry Krasner. So as we've covered here on the briefing previously, police unions fuel this national crisis of police violence that we're seeing. They perpetuate warrior cop culture and often openly declare quote unquote war on elected officials who challenge their worldview. This contributes to increasing militarization, secrecy, and lack of accountability to the public. And this has real consequences for public safety. So experts have found that after police began unionizing, police killings of civilians significantly increased. Meanwhile, these unions also ensure that lying or violent cops are not held accountable, working with them to protect their employment. And even if they're fired from one department, bad cops can regularly get employed somewhere else. So this movement to reject police union support comes at a really unique moment too. When communities are looking for ways to preserve public health and safety that don't rely on the presence of armed police officers who put people in danger. But first, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the scope of the problem, how we got here in the first place. So Circuit Attorney Kim Gardner, I'd like to start with you. Earlier this year, you filed a lawsuit against St. Louis City and the St. Louis Police Officers Association, alleging that they were colluding as part of a racist effort to block parts of your reform agenda. Tell us a little bit about what the police union did exactly to prompt this lawsuit from you.
Well, as you know, this is a pending litigation, so I have to, one, be careful with what I say because there is pending litigation. But one of the issues we had is about the will of the people. People elected us as local prosecutors to do our job, to pursue justice under the laws for everyone. And what this lawsuit entails is the coordinated few, the powerful few who work together to stop and thwart this and silence the elected official by voter suppression. And this is every attempts that have been made by the powerful few, including the police union, to even recently where they've went to the legislator to help with my governor as well as the attorney general to give that those individuals concurrent jurisdiction only in my jurisdiction. So when you are looking at the coordinated efforts of the police union to basically prosecutor shop, prosecutorial discretion, that is what we're talking about when we have suits like mine that articulates there's a coordinated effort to silence the will of the people who elect us to enact criminal justice reform in the jurisdictions we represent. And mine is the city of St. Louis.
Thank you. Commonwealth's Attorney Stephanie Morales, I want to turn to you real quick. In 2016, you successfully prosecuted a police officer for shooting and killing an 18-year-old black man, William Chapman. But police officers in general are rarely held accountable when they kill. For example, the officers who killed Breonna Taylor, Jacob Blake, Daniel Prude, for example, have yet to face charges. And even when those charges are filed, convictions can be really difficult for prosecutors to obtain. So I want to ask about your experience with this. When you sought to hold an officer accountable, how did the police union in that jurisdiction respond?
Well, it's important to point out that, one, I know your question is about the response of the police union, but the number one important thing to me is the response of the community, the people who elected me to serve. And the response from the community was one of collective, appreciation for being seen in the process. And so when we talk about police unions, sometimes we fail to speak to the importance of community and who really comes first when we're thinking about the duties that we have in serving the public. So, I saw the standard reaction that I see oftentimes when someone is seeking to hold police accountable. And I saw many police showing up to support the officer who was charged in that case. But again, on the other side, I saw community showing up to support the effort to hold those accountable who took the life of a young man who was supposed to be present with us today, and who our community and his family, we will never stop feeling the loss of what happened tragically on April 22nd, 2015. So, the response wasn't uncommon. We see this time and time again, but we also have to acknowledge that on the other end of this movement that we see from law enforcement is community and the people who are at risk when we don't hold law enforcement accountable for wrongdoing.
Thank you. I'll turn next to Philadelphia DA Larry Krasner. Larry, the head of the Philadelphia Police Union, has repeatedly called for challengers to run against you in the upcoming election. How does the police union's presence and voice impact Philadelphia politics, and why do you view police union support as at odds with the role of a prosecutor?
Well, it is at odds. And the fact is, when I ran the first time, I'm coming up for a re-elect pretty soon, but when I ran the first time, I rejected any donations. I rejected endorsement. It's not because I do not like police officers. There are a lot of police officers in Philly I'm actually very close to, I respect and admire very much. But it goes to the root of where these unions come from and who they are. Number one, it's almost ironic we call them unions. They have a long history of being anti-labor, but I guess it got to be useful much later after they've been putting down labor for doing things like trying to end child labor and have weekends and such. Eventually they became unions. This is why most of them are called fraternal orders or brotherhoods, which, by the way, does not include the sisterhood, and it kind of should. Second, I think it's important to remember that in most cities, even a very diverse city like Philadelphia, these unions are led entirely by very conservative, very Republican, very white people who represent an old voice. In Philadelphia, you can be a member of the union and be retired 20 years, and you can vote for the leadership. So you look at some of these cities and you see these Archie Bunker types, you see these, frankly, knuckle dragging heads of the unions come out, and you have to look at it and say, this can't possibly be the average police officer in this modern diverse city. Well, it's not. Philadelphia is 85% anti-Trump. The leadership of the Philadelphia Union is basically 100% pro-Trump. And then the next day, the African American Officers Association comes out and starts raising hell because the union has endorsed someone they despise, and they should despise. So we need to remember they're the voice of the past, but they're very powerful. And especially in a state like California or a state like Pennsylvania, what happens is if a big city politician, and most DAs historically have been people who are ambitious, who might want to be a US senator, they might want to be a governor, something like that. For people who are a big wheel in the city because they've become the DA but want to run statewide, a lot of those chief prosecutors are looking to satisfy the fraternal brotherhood, whatever it may be, of police so that they can run statewide. So look at Pennsylvania, for example, my state. Arlen Specter was a young DA in Philly at 35 years of age. He became a US senator he almost controlled, who got on the US Supreme Court, and he did a lot of it by making the FOP happy in Philly. Ed Rendell was DA at 33. He became the mayor. He became the governor. He became close friends with Bill Clinton. He's still a major voice in the Democratic Party, even though he's well into his 70s. And this happens why? It happens because when you make the FOP happy in a big city, and the big cities are more progressive than the rest of the state, then the FOP is going to make the rest of the state happy and make it easier for you to run. That is the danger they present. They have an outsized level of power statewide. And so it becomes politically very convenient for prosecutors to look the other way, not to prosecute them. Well, it's even worse if those prosecutors take their money and take their endorsement and then have to sit, as their obligation, their oath requires, in judgment on whether or not they're credible enough to testify, whether or not they have committed a violent crime against someone. We have a case right now against an inspector, a very high-level police officer, for sexually assaulting 3 women police officers. Those are politically not the easiest cases to bring. And people like Kim Gardner and Stephanie Morales, Diana Beckton have been incredibly courageous about stepping up and holding police accountable and doing their job. It just gets harder if we take money and endorsements from these unions.
Thank you. I want to turn now to District Attorney Diana Becton to discuss something that Larry just touched on. DA Becton, you've talked about the need to build trust between communities and institutions like prosecutors' offices. As you sort of go about the process of trying to reestablish trust, create these relationships, how does the presence, the voice of influence affect what you're trying to do there? I got to ask you to unmute though. I want to hear this.
There we go.
There it is.
About that. So we really have a tremendous amount of work ahead of us if we're going to restore trust in our profession. And as we know, there have been so many, high-profile cases lately. Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Floyd, and these are tragic cases that really squarely focus our attention on the criminal justice system's approach to cases where police officers are the suspects. So district attorneys will undoubtedly review those incidents that involve police officers, as DA Krasner just said. So as prosecutors, we're in a very unique position. Of course, every day we have to work very closely, hand in glove, with law enforcement officers. That's the only way that we're going to effectively prosecute cases and bring justice to victims of crime. However, that same reliance and the relationships between prosecutors and law enforcement can become very challenging once we undertake the responsibility to prosecute an officer. So across California, there are dozens of law enforcement unions representing rank and file police officers and sheriffs and correctional officers. These well-founded unions play a major role in local and state and even national politics. And elected prosecutors who solicit and accept political endorsements and financial support from those same unions create the appearance of a conflict of interest. So right now in our country, with the crisis on the issue of trust in law enforcement, this is an important issue. So today I'm really focusing our conversation on restoring that public confidence, because the appearance of fairness is essential to the way that our system functions. I'm a former judge, and the appearance of impropriety is a very, very familiar standard to me. Although the standards might be a little bit different for judges and for prosecutors and defense attorneys, we still all have an obligation to avoid conflicts of interest. And there is certainly an appearance of a conflict and an appearance of a lack of independence when prosecutors investigate and evaluate cases where police are the suspects. So that needs to change, and it needs to change now. This is kind of a start. It's going to be a long journey to restore that confidence, but it really is a necessary step. And that's why I want to stand with other prosecutors who say, let's take the steps now, because we have to restore trust and confidence in our system. Take money out of and political influence out of the equation so that we can take this step to restore that trust and confidence. In California, we're saying cure the conflict, hashtag cure the conflict. Thank you.
Oh, see, now I did the mute thing. We're all in this together. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I want to open this up a little bit. So I'll direct this question first to Larry, but again, anyone else who wants to jump in, just give me a little hand signal. Larry, you touched on this a little bit earlier. You talked about the distinction between labor unions and police unions in particular. And I want to drill down on that a little bit, because I know a lot of folks might think, unions, great, I support organized labor. Really, what makes those organizations different?
Well, first and foremost, what other union serves people who are empowered to shoot other people, to arrest other people? It is a special kind of job. There are superpowers that police have that a carpenter does not have, an electrician does not have, someone who is cleaning a hospital does not have. I mean, that's fundamental. It is a position of public trust, which not all unions are, many are not. And therefore, we have to look at it in a different way.
Can I also say something?
Yeah, of course.
And just to piggyback off of what DA Krasner is saying, he started the conversation of really articulating how these unions are different. these unions have, and I know he has a lot of experience, and Stephanie Morales and all of us, and Dinah Beckton, and they want to say, and I want them to articulate this also, but this is the bully pulpit. This is the threats that we receive when we are doing our job to be true ministers of justice. So no police union is going to tell you, or any other union will come to you and tell you, if you hold us accountable, we're going to, one, stop working. We're not going to police in your communities to make you the cause or say you're the cause of violent crime in your communities. And right now we're in a very unique time that we have police unions with, I call him 45, to promote divisiveness and rhetoric of this anti-law enforcement, where it's perpetuating a fear that is causing problems with prosecutors like ourselves to, one, promote justice. And when you have people who will threaten your livelihood, not just whether you do your job, will tell you, we will make it difficult for you to do your job in every way. And they have the platform to have the media report it with lies and misinformation. I want my colleagues to share some of the horrors that we face, that when you oversize a police union, like in many of our cities, it causes problems with justice and integrity for all.
Thanks. I want to turn to another question here that Stephanie touched on briefly, but I think it's important to emphasize that this issue, this conflict, this dynamic is not just one as between police unions on the one hand and prosecutors on the other. So we have polling, for example, that shows that 6 in 10 voters would support affirmative ethics rules that prevent prosecutors from accepting contributions from police unions. This is something that has public support. We see less than a quarter of voters oppose this idea. In your experience, are people understanding this? What do you hear from constituents about this issue in particular?
So you have, on the one hand, many people who understand exactly what's going on because they have had experiences with the criminal legal system and with their rights having been violated by members of the law enforcement community, having been ignored, and not had that accountability with prosecutors. And they understand this better than people could ever imagine. They're very intelligent with respect to this very issue. And they want accountability in every form. And that means any barrier to that accountability, they're in favor for removing those barriers. And so, I think a lot of times people in positions of power, they discount the level of attention that members of our community are paying to these issues. Because what we think of as a decision-making process about whether or not to accept a contribution is actually a matter of life and death for those members of our community who are surveilled and policed and their rights are violated at a very high level constantly. And so, this is on the radar of a lot of people. But at the very basic level, if they're not understanding how this ties into everyday life, if, they're still at risk. They're still at risk for these types of violations. They're still at risk for the danger that happens when there is not accountability. So it's very, very important to discuss all the time the importance of removing any barrier to systemic accountability for public actors who are doing wrong on a consistent basis. And this is one that should just be a very easy thing that we can all commit and agree to.
Thank you. I guess I'll close by asking a little bit broader of a question. So you've all signed on to this letter, but your letter also makes clear that this is a starting place, not the finish line, that this is but one step that must be taken, refusing contributions from police unions in a series of steps that are necessary to sort of meet this moment of police accountability and racial justice. What are some of the other steps that you intend to take in your powers, in your offices, in the months to come? Diana, you want to start us?
Sure, I will. I was thinking about a letter that that a number of us also signed on to, that outlines about 10 steps that we're going to be taking or have already taken in our local jurisdictions. And so many of us, and I won't reiterate all the work that we've already done in our efforts toward decarceration, but in this particular time, I think we're all doing work. We're all agreeing that we will not prosecute peaceful protesters, in addition to not accepting the funding from police unions. We're also looking at how we evaluate cases that come to us where there are allegations of use of force against law enforcement. And we're requiring our offices to review all of the available evidence, including any body-worn camera that might be available. And we are making sure that our offices are held accountable in that way. We're also standing up to expand our charging policies on declining low-level offenses. And also, we are supporting and advocating for increases in funding to community-led and community-defined responses. And then the last thing I'll mention is something I just rolled out in the last couple of weeks, and that is a working group to completely reimagine youth justice in our community so that we look for efforts on the front end to keep our youth out of the criminal justice system, and also look towards closing the prisons that we keep our youth locked up in.
Thank you. Anyone else like to chime in on this?
I was trying to unmute real fast. So
Yeah,
I'll talk really quickly. I think, to just put it in no uncertain terms, we have to reduce the footprint of the criminal legal system on the lives of the members of our community, period. We have to stop trying to solve all the problems of our society by introducing people into the criminal legal system. We have to stop that. We have to decarcerate. We have to end mass incarceration. We have to advocate for legislative reform in the area of ending the no-knock warrants. We have to advocate for legislative reform that will protect the members of our community. But above all, as members of the prosecution profession, we have to hold ourselves accountable, and we have to hold each other accountable to actually prosecute the cases when there is wrongdoing. And we have to be committed to that. It can't be a halfway effort. My case that I prosecuted, I led that prosecution myself because it was the first one, and I needed to show my community how committed I was. So we should systemically put measures in place to end the systemic racism, to end the mass incarceration, but be above and beyond. We have to be committed to actually fighting the fight when it's time, and not allowing corrupt police officers or any public actors to get away with harming the members of our community.
Thank you, Stephanie. I think that's a great place to leave it. It's certainly fascinating to watch the role of the DA and the prosecutor changing in real time, even faster than it's been over the past several years as a result of this national moment that we're facing. So I want to thank each of you for joining our panel today. And to our viewers at home, thanks for watching. Have a good, safe, long holiday.